Okay, I don't think we can wait any longer. We've got a really full program as always. So we'll get started and let others catch up as we go along. So good morning, good afternoon. My name is Steve Kenzie. Welcome to our session today. I'm the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK, and it's a great pleasure to have you join us for the 5th session in our 6-part Transitioning to a Circular Economy webinar series. Today, we will be discussing the circular economy in the context of our food and agricultural systems. Before we get going, though, a bit of housekeeping. First, the session is being recorded, and we will be sharing the recording after the session ends. So do note that. Also, we are in webinar mode for today's program, and so that means you as attendees will not be able to unmute or share your video, but we're still really keen to have you actively participate, and we've got a couple of ways of doing that. Firstly, through the chat box. If you want to say hello, tell us how the weather is where you are, share your LinkedIn profile, comment on anything that you're hearing, the chat box is the place to do that. And you can find a button at the bottom of your screen where you can enter in the chat box. And do please check that the blue box is sending your message where you want it to go, if you want that to go to everyone, or if you just want it to go to host and panelists or a specific attendee. If you have a question for our panelists once the Q&A program starts, then please put your questions into the Q&A box, also a button at the bottom of your screen. That's where I'm going to be looking for questions to present to our fantastic panelists. And if you just put your question into the chat, it may get lost. And we are not able, Zoom doesn't allow us as moderators to post questions into the Q&A. So if you post it into the chat, we'll be posting soon after, asking you to copy it over to the Q&A box. So let's try and get it right the first time. Also, for you to engage with the Q&A box is a thumbs up button. If you see a question in the Q&A that you're really keen to have us answer, then do click on the thumbs up. That will vote it up to the top of the pile and improve the likelihood that we'll get to it. The last few sessions in this series, we've had way more questions than we've been able to get to. So that upvoting feature is really critical and really helpful. So do keep the Q&A box open, have a look at the questions that are coming in, and give a thumbs up to the ones you'd like us to focus on. Any technical difficulties, please put that in the chat box. If you require captions, we have activated the automatic captions that are produced by Zoom. You can click on a button at the bottom of your screen to turn those on. Again, please forgive any typos or mistakes. It is an automatic program. And final bit of housekeeping, if you would like to post on social media about anything you're hearing in the session, you're certainly encouraged to do so. Please tag us and use the hashtag T2C, Transition to Circular Economy, so T2CE 2023. More details on that have just been posted into the chat, so please do take advantage. Okay. Let's move on to our next slide and just a brief introduction to the UN Global Compact. Global Compact Network UK is part of the UN Global Compact, which is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative with more than 20,000 participating companies globally. Our initiative is built on a foundation of 10 universal principles for responsible business that have been drawn from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. To join the initiative requires a commitment from your CEO to operationalize our principles throughout your organization, to report annually on the progress you're making towards this end, and to support the wider UN agenda. Our role as a network here in the UK is to support UK-based members to fulfill these commitments, and we do so by organizing over 100 engagement opportunities every year to inspire ambition and to enable action. If your company is not already participating in the UN Global Compact, please do get in touch. There's some details for how you can connect to us on this in the chat. And if you're from outside the UK, there are local networks in almost every country in the world. And we'd be very happy to help connect you to our colleagues that work there. So please don't hesitate. Okay, next slide, please. A big part of our mission related to that wider UN development agenda is to drive business engagement with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the SDGs. The goals provide a comprehensive and coherent roadmap to create the future we want, and business has a big role to play in achieving these goals. I encourage you to think about how your work impacts the SDGs, and to that end, I would just like to flag that today's session is particularly linked to Goal 12, which calls on us to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. But of course, the goals are quite interlinked, and several more are highly relevant to today's conversation. Next slide. In today's session, we're going to be focusing on circularity for food and agricultural systems. Incorporating the principles of a circular economy into our food and agricultural systems could provide enhanced food security for a growing population, build natural capital, regenerate degraded lands, allow nature to thrive, and support our collective climate goals. Unfortunately, the current food and agricultural system does not work for everyone, and industrial farming practices have led to agriculture becoming a leading source of greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, soil degradation, and deforestation. This session is going to explore the ways that different stakeholders involved in food and agriculture value chains can support the implementation of regenerative agricultural techniques, reduce food waste, and improve sourcing and ingredient selection to create a more circular and sustainable food and agricultural system. To help us do this, we're joined by a fantastic panel of speakers, which I would like to note are really trying to be part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem, and are doing lots of really fantastic stuff to that end. So first up, we're going to hear from Hollander, Global Farming Expertise Manager at Danone. Then we have Alice Ritchie, Lead on Nature and Forest Manager, or the Lead Nature and Forest Manager at Tesco. Then we have René Lyon, Senior Consumer Scientist at Unilever. And finally, Hans Loth, Global Head of UN Environment Partnerships at Rabobank. Before I hand over to Kees-Jan, just a quick reminder, as we go along, please put your comments into the chat and your questions into the Q&A box. No need to wait. You can start doing both of those things as soon as something pops to mind. And so, without any further ado, Kees-Jan, over to you. Apologies.
No worries, Steve. Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure. I would really thank the connection in the UK for making this available, and I'm very humble as well to share here with the participants the view of the work that we do here at Danone. And the clear focus is regenerative agriculture, and it is not just a broad word that brings a sense of belonging to everyone, but it really makes some sense here. And I'm extremely proud to be able to work in this space, as agriculture has been and is still very close to my heart. If you see on the next slide, it is a very deep dive immediately into our approach and actions. And for those of you out there, which I can almost not believe, but you don't know Danone, Danone is bringing health through food to as many people as possible. And we do that via our businesses in water, in specialized nutrition for babies and for elderly, or in hospitals. But a large part is also with essential dairy and plant-based products, right? And by saying that, immediately you will recognize that many of these products that we bring on the shelf for consumers have an origin in agriculture. And as a company, we have also put out commitments. We are committed really to work in the space to whatever is out there. So fight climate change and really protect and value our waters. And also when it comes to our packaging, here's the wording of the day as well, focusing there a lot on circular economy. But as a fourth one, really to preserve planet and focus on what we want to achieve, is agriculture. Agriculture plays a vital role, not just in what we source or where we are buying our products, but also they have a big impact. First of all, impact in terms of our business is towards our commitments. For example, when we see that we have a commitment for the reduction of methane by 2030 with 30% of our total supply chain. There, the majority of this methane is coming from agriculture and very specifically coming from dairy. So from all our milk and dairy ingredients that we purchase. Right, so just to indicate there, but also socially, around the world, we not just purchase products or raw materials. Those are produced by farmers. And those farmers need to be kept farming because otherwise we run out of those products. Right, so really to focus there, and there we have a huge social responsibility as well. And finally, as milk is also a big part of our business in dairy ingredients, it's also, and also meat and fish that we purchase for our first diet products, also animal welfare and the promotion, the bolstering of animal welfare is extremely important. We cannot let those animals suffer for the good of our business, of our products. Now, this is really our approach and the way it works towards our commitments. And this circularity, today I would like to share a little bit of view in the time that I have about agriculture. That's why I highlighted it. And if we zoom into agriculture, you will see on the next slide, I really put the focus on where we are sourcing milk, because milk is a big part of our business. And we do that for the majority of a direct milk supply. Now you see the map of the world in front of you, and those dark colored blue, if you have, if it's really clear on your screen, the dark colored, this is where we have a direct supply, meaning every 1 or 2 days, a milk truck is entering the farm collecting milk. There, I put some granularity towards it for you to make it clear where we source the majority of milk, right, over the different regions. And next to that, you see the regions, but you also see some of the legenda, and I put it next to it. It's just for you as an audience to see the complexity as well. Because not first of all, we source in all the different regions, right? Some more than others, but still, we are there. If you see the colors, and on the right-hand side, you see the different farming models. Some are pasture-based, could be partial, right? But for example, in South Africa, we've got farms that graze 365. Right, and farms that have a high feed autonomy or have intensive farming with less land available, but also organic models. All are present in our supply chain. And then, obviously, for those who are very connected to agriculture, you can imagine that also farm sizes differ a lot, from small family farms with less than 50 cows to also large-scale family farms with over 1,000 cows. Some are more present than others in a different model. So you see immediately also the complexity of how to drive these kind of changes. And that is actually also how we are looking at improving, because if we are improving regenerative agriculture, if we want to have a model, if we want to implement those kind of changes, we have to see what is the model that those farmers that we work with have at the moment. Because it's not just that we share a blueprint. This is how to farm. It doesn't work like that. If that might be a thought that comes across your mind. It simply doesn't work like that. And from our end, we also don't push for a model. Sometimes we get the question, oh, so you always push for those large-scale industrial farming. No, we don't push for that. We want farmers to be resilient in the region, in the ecosystem where they're at. But it also means that if we want to move towards circularity inside regenerative agriculture, how are you going to achieve that? What will be the first and foremost activity that a farmer should do? In our milk sourcing strategy, we also have defined different models of how we are going to valorize farmers for that milk. What does that mean? Still, 75% roughly of our global milk volume, we source and we pay the farmer according to the local or the global market prices at that moment. But 25% of our global milk volume, and that differs per region, we source milk and we have made a commitment, a long-term commitment with those farmers that we are going to pay those farmers according to the cost of production of milk in that region. So a complete disconnect with the market price at that moment, meaning that currently when we see in big parts of the world feed prices increasing, energy prices increasing, fertilizing cost increasing, means also that at that time the value that we give for that milk to those farmers is increasing as well. And in this long-term contract we have secured for the whole period of time the margin as well. And that is our way to move with farmers towards these regenerative agricultural practice, not just top down and put in a contract by saying we need milk produced in this way. No, we go with farmers, see what is the possibilities and what can you do in your region, in that neck of the woods where you are, in that corner of the world where you are, right? And by doing so is what you see on the next slide as an example for how we work together. We play a modest role in the dairy world. Danone is not the biggest milk sourcing company. We have we work a lot with, I always say, roughly 60,000 farmers around the world. That doesn't make the world change. It's a drop in the ocean. But we do take the responsibility to learn from others, but also to share these best practices. And that's why 4 years ago, we started this alliance called Farming for Generations, where we work together with 7 other global partners in the value chain of the farm to see and identify what is the best practice in a region, to showcase that to other farmers, because we, and I personally as well, believe very strongly in farmers that learn from farmers principle, right? I can share a lot and other experts as well, but if the neighbor is doing somewhat and you can learn from his or him's practices, always good. But we always said, hey, let's work together and let's team with these partners, each have their expertise and place in the value chain, to work together, identify a best practice and share that amongst their portfolio. So then all of a sudden we go much further than only the 60,000 farmers of Danone. All of a sudden you have a wide, much more scale, you have much more speed, and you've got much more expertise. And of course, to make sure that we also stay on track and to not just work in these kind of models, we use also advisors like WWF France, Compassion in World Farming, or the University of Wageningen. And over those last 3 years, we were able to really pioneer with 33 farmers in roughly 8 countries. And those pioneers already motivated and made enthusiastic other farmers, 225 farmers who were actively involved. And that broadened up, that scaled up to 2,600 who've heard of these practices. And that is just only the very much beginning. It's like an igniting wheel, right? And this is really one example I would love to share with all of you here. And please, and I'm also seeing it here, it's on the chat. It's also some knowledge that we made available for all of you. And yes, there is also a login button, but feel free to reach out, because if it makes sense in your space, if you want to learn more, reach out, and then we just provide you with this kind of login. Just that we want to keep it a little bit under control. But this is really how Danone is working via regenerative agriculture, securing supply for our business, absolutely, making sure we are reaching our commitments for sure, but also make sure that we have resilient farmers who we can work with nowadays, but also in the future. And that might have you missed maybe the discussion about circular economy in this one, but me personally as well, I think that agriculture is one of the greatest examples of how circularity can work, right? So that plays in itself. If I had more time, I would have loved to deep dive with you on that one. And on my next slide is just to want to say a big thank you again for your time and space here, and feel free to address any questions you may like. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kees-Jan. Could I ask you just to let's do a little bit of a deep dive, because we've got a couple of minutes. I'm interested in the really practical, because as a, you know, I have farming in my family history, and I worked on farms when I was a kid, but it's been a while. And but it seems fairly linear to a non-farmer. And so I mean, aside from, if you'll, you know, pardon me saying that the manure, which is clearly going to be recycled on a typical farm, but could you give us a few of sort of the key practical actions that you're supporting farmers to take to make their farming more regenerative and circular, as opposed to linear models? What does it look like in practice?
Right, and with the comment of manure, you want to take me into that example?
Well, I think that's an obvious one. That's, you know, that's been probably that's been the case for years and years and years. So maybe what are newer developments around circularity? But really the biggest things, I suppose, because again, I'm not an agriculture expert like yourself. No, definitely. Well, one item that we use a lot is, and it is at a certain point also quite common in, for example, in the United States, where they are separating from the liquid manure that comes out of these barns, right? Which is a mixture of, yeah, let's say water, feces, urine, and everything. They separate the solid parts from the liquids. At the very beginning, it was very much used because then the solid part could be loaded on trucks and transported again to parts where they were growing feed, right? And the liquid, which is of course, high volume product, they could spread that close by. Nowadays, what you already notice is that, for example, what they do is that they compose that solid part, right? And we've done trials also, again, in cooperation with universities, to see, instead of composting, that you ferment it, right? So you ferment this manure. Now, it's quite technical, but in the end of the day, you were saving carbon. You know, that's one area as well, because I think this manure example that you gave is which is great, right? So that's really something. When it comes to circularity, and I think that's maybe very obvious, is that still that cows eat, of course, what's grown on the farm. But due to the developments over the last decade, farms became more intensive, meaning they have less soil close by. And it was, of course, also became with the growth and export of feed coming from all over the places of the world. Now, more and more, you see that farmers are getting back to say, okay, what's the kind of soil and how much land do I have around me, but also what's coming from the industry, right? So, and I won't call it waste, because sometimes it's waste, but those are valuable byproducts that could replace feed, which is coming a long way. For example, soy from other parts of the world, right? Soy is a great product, also for dairy cows. But this kind of protein source could also become locally, like here in my part of the world, where we have quite some breweries who make great beers, right? That remain from those breweries is an excellent product for dairy cows as a protein source to produce high valorized milk. You see, so it works both ends. What is not usable for human beings, it can be used by cows as well, amongst other species. I think that's a really valuable insight that you clicked for me, is that we don't need to think about circularity within just the farm, or even just within the food, within that narrow thinking, but bringing in waste products from other value chains is going to be a key component to this. Thank you, Kees-Jan. We'll be coming back to you. We've triggered a whole bunch of questions, which is fabulous. So thanks everybody for putting those questions in. Don't forget to give a thumbs up to the questions you're most keen for us to focus in on. And now, a very different perspective, we're going to hear from Alice.
Great, thank you so much for that, Steve. Right, so my name's Alice. I am the lead nature and forest manager at Tesco, and then I also lead our partnership with WWF. So hopefully going to run you through some bits and pieces about what we're doing, both individually within Tesco, but also in our partnership to support a circular economy and sustainable agriculture. Can I go to the next slide? Is that how we do it? Perfect. So here is in the scheme of things, absolutely tiny snapshot of some of the work that we're doing at the moment across sustainability. Net zero is very much our North Star, we're calling it. Everything, all the work that we do, we're aiming for it to ladder up into our net zero by 2050 across our supply chain commitment. Built into that is net zero across our own operations by 2035, a deadline that's coming up pretty quickly, but hopefully we're on track to meet. And the aim of all of the work that we do in our supply chain is really to feed into that, to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're aiming to reduce emissions. But as I imagine everyone on this call will be very well aware, there are often trade-offs. It's really important. We're also in the midst of a nature crisis, and the nature crisis and the climate crisis are mutually accelerating. So we know that for food production in particular, we can't produce food without a healthy natural environment. So a huge amount of our focus is shifted towards biodiversity, nature, water, and deforestation. So a big part of the work that we do, and a lot of this is done in partnership with WWF, is around landscape scale, catchment scale action. Ultimately, we can be doing everything we want to be doing in our supply chains. We can know that all of our farmers are doing X, Y, and Z within their own farms, but if their neighbours aren't doing it, or there's other practices going on in the region that are negatively impacting water quality, for example, we're not going to see long-term environmental improvements. So with that in mind, we have highlighted a number of different priority catchments. So these are basically areas where we know we source quite a lot of food from, and then also places where potentially there might be some disproportionate environmental impacts happening. So for Tesco, some of those areas that we've identified in Kenya, South Africa, across the UK, we've got the River Wye, a catchment in East Anglia, and also one in the Soar. So these are programs of work where we work with local NGOs, groups that are on the ground, able to work really closely, directly with farmers. And it doesn't matter if they're Tesco farmers or not Tesco farmers, we're just hoping that they will all start to achieve the same practices and we can start seeing long-term environmental change. We're extending this approach to marine sustainability too. We're aiming to work at a seascape level and consider marine ecosystems as part of a wider picture of sustainability, rather than just focusing in on individual products. It's a challenging way to work, to be honest. When you're a large multinational retailer, it's much easier to work in a kind of linear way up and down supply chains, but we know that landscape work is incredibly important. So that's why we've been focusing on it. Transformational change is the second one. A lot of this is around convening with other retailers. So I just assumed that everyone knows who Tesco is, but we're the largest retailer in the UK. But despite being the largest, there's still a huge number of things that we need the support of the wider industry to do. And we know that collectively, when we come together pre-competitively as a group, we can really aim to influence change. So one of the great ways that we've been able to do this is through the WWF basket. So Tesco and WWF in our partnership that started in 2018 created a basket. The plan was to use this set of metrics within the basket to halve the environmental impact of the average UK shopping basket. So that's what it was centered around. And what we've tried to do through this is now get 5 other retailers signed up to it. So it's now Tesco's, Sainsbury's, there's a high chance we're going to get one, M&S, Waitrose, Lidl, and someone else who'll be really mad at me for forgetting them. But the idea being that if we're all signed up to the same metrics, we can all work together to achieve change and do it in a pre-competitive way. Driving deforestation commitments. This is again a huge one in the scheme of things. We aren't necessarily a big customer of soy that comes from places like the Amazon basin or Brazil or Argentina. or palm from Indonesia, but we know when we work together as a collective UK retail group, we can have a lot more influence. So we've driven the UK soy manifesto, and we're also engaged in some different pieces of work that I'll dive into in a little bit more detail shortly. And then that last point there around driving change through advocacy, certification, standards, and regulation. This is actually, I think, one of the key ways that we're able to help support change is by demonstrating the importance of high agricultural standards and certification systems, as well as really strong regulation. So we work closely with DEFRA in the UK on their new environmental land management scheme, thinking really carefully, how does public money from the government intersect with private money that comes from up and down the supply chain? It's, you know, a big question for a company like Tesco. So we're really hopeful that by working with government and working with farmers, we can help make sure that we're very supportive of that kind of how that scheme works to support farmers. Certification, again, is a really big one for us as well. So we've committed to sourcing all of our fresh produce from Leaf Mark certified farms. So Leaf Mark is a really high environmental standard for farming. So all of our produce that is sourced within the UK is now certified as of December 2022. And we're aiming to have that across our entire international supply chains for fruit and vegetables by the end of 2025. Technology and innovation, this is where a lot of the circularity stuff, the really cool circularity stuff, I think, comes in. What we're doing in terms of biodiversity has been really around measurement. How can we measure what's taking place on farms? So that picture there is a tool called AgriSound, which we've been looking at in some of our fresh fruit supply chains across Spain and in England. It's essentially microphone technology, bioacoustics with AI that can track different pollinators and pests that are flying past. So our suppliers are able to use it to know how they're going in terms of biodiversity and pollination levels, but also use it as a pest management tool, which has been incredibly useful. And then really one of our key initiatives on circularity and circular supply chains has been the Tesco Exchange. So this is a really cool initiative that we've put up on our supplier network. And the idea is that any Tesco supplier can put up a waste product or a product that they don't need, either for free or for a trade or for sale. And then another supplier can connect with them and see what's up there, and if they need it for some reason within their supply chain. So there's all sorts of different things on there, like tons of beetroot juice, a whole lot of potato protein, different like plastic bag tools, and all sorts of different bits and pieces, which has been really cool. And we've been informally doing that for a while. We had an event probably a year or so ago, and one of our key beauty product manufacturing companies was connecting with one of our avocado growers and discussing how they can be using the avocado stones to put in exfoliants and stuff like that. And that was kind of what prompted the idea. How do we as a retailer that has supply chains all over the place with all sorts of different products, how can we start creating that truly circular economy? Next slide, please. So to go a little bit deeper on the partnership that we have with WWF, it is really around creating affordable, sustainable and healthy food for all, with that goal overarching to halve the environmental impact of the average UK shopping basket. The bit that I work most closely on is that middle pillar, restoring nature and food production, but we've got a huge focus around eliminating waste, both food waste, but also plastic packaging, and helping customers eat more sustainable diets. So being able to use the resource and the expertise and the knowledge of the phenomenal staff that are at WWF has been invaluable for us. I mean, they've just got, they're the most well-respected, I'd say, environmental charity in the world. And so to have them supporting us on our sustainable food journey has been really fantastic. And again, they're great at collating the industry to bring all the other retailers together, bring some of our suppliers together, and help identify what we should be looking at, and then work with us to support different bits and pieces, and a lot of specific on-farm interventions, like herbal lays in our dairy supply chain. They've been supporting us with some low carbon fertilizer trials, biodiversity trials, again, all sorts of bits and pieces. So it's been, a really powerful and fantastic partnership for the last 4 years. Next slide. I'm just going to run through a deep dive into a couple of key areas where we're trying to support sustainability initiatives and work towards a more circular economy. So the first one is going into these catchment approaches in a little bit more detail. So South Africa is a really big sourcing region for the whole of the UK. We source a lot of fresh fruit from there, fresh vegetables, and then also it's a big wine growing region. But as I'm sure many people on the call will know, chronically water stressed. It's an area, particularly the Kroonlandberg catchment, where we're really we're seeing huge amounts of water essentially not being in the catchment anymore. And a lot of this came down to the fact that there were a huge number of invasive trees that were growing in that region. And so from our perspective, what we knew is that if the trees are all there essentially taking up all the water, that means there's not enough for farmers, there's not enough for local communities, there's not enough to grow the food that we absolutely rely on in the UK. So we worked with WWF, with local environmental groups on the ground, with the South African government to say, right, what can we do in this region? How can we support this? And how can we both basically support local biodiversity, but also water scarcity, water security in this region. So phase one of the work was around clearing all of the invasive plant species from the catchment. Potentially seems counterintuitive, but one of our key projects was ripping trees out of the ground. But the second phase of the project is around establishing an indigenous plant nursery so that we can replant the catchment. And this is work this program has been going on for a few years now. So we've now started with the planting. And the idea being to recreate the ecosystem that was initially there with indigenous plant species that support the water security in the region. And we've seen a huge amount of success with it. It's been really fantastic. We've got over 800 hectares of alien vegetation have been cleared, returning 6.5 billion litres of water back into the catchment every year, creating jobs in the region, working really closely with local farmers and really trying to make sure that we've got a strong community engagement approach that's really supportive, and also so that it can become more of a almost like a self-sufficient initiative. You know, once that land has been cleared and the farmers are bought into the fact that we need to keep invasive tree species out of the region, they can be more motivated to be making sure that they're not coming back, essentially. So that's been a project that we're really proud of. Second slide. To go a little bit further into some of our work on deforestation. So again, this is really about that transformative change. This is a hugely challenging topic, but massive for us. I mean, as an example, our two biggest carbon emitting products by volume are pork and poultry, and that's because of the land use change associated with deforestation that goes into the animal feed. So it's a big issue for us. I'm sure it'll be a big issue for some of the others on the call as well. And it's something that we absolutely need to be trying to change, but they're complex supply chains. They're not very transparent. It's really, really difficult to action this individually. So we launched the UK Soy Manifesto in 2021, and that's now got over 60% of UK soy usage represented in it. So a number of other retailers, companies like Nando's, anyone that's got a big soy footprint, essentially, we're trying to get involved in the Soy Manifesto. And now what we do is cascade the requirements in that to make sure that we're sourcing deforestation and conversion-free soy by 2025, another looming deadline, cascade that down to our suppliers. And so we ask any supplier to Tesco that has a soy footprint of over 250 tonnes has to have a really credible soy sourcing policy in a roadmap to demonstrate how they're going to achieve deforestation and conversion-free soy. And again, coming back to circularity, a lot of this is around alternative feeds. What can we be sourcing from other sectors and putting into potentially the animal feed supply chains? How can we lobby different governments to think about putting processed animal protein into it? We're doing a lot of work with insects and looking at how we can divert food waste from Tesco stores into black soldier fly factories, I don't quite know what the word is, where the black soldier flies essentially eat the food waste, break it down, and then are converted, and their larvae are converted into animal feed. So really trying to find alternative protein sources for animals through circularity. And the Responsible Commodities Facility is again a bit like another landscape project in a way. We, with some other retailers, invested $11 million to launch the Responsible Commodities Facility last year, aiming to change the financial drivers and incentives for farmers in Brazil so that they are incentivized essentially not to deforest and to continue producing sustainable products on their land. So that's been really successful. We've managed to, through the program, have managed to conserve 8,500 hectares of native vegetation forestry, or savanna type areas in the Cerrado. And we're now profiling more farmers and really looking to expand it in the second round. So it's been, again, a hopefully really exciting project to achieve actionable change in some of the areas where we know we're having the biggest impact on nature and biodiversity, and also climate. I think that might be me. I don't think there was another slide. So yeah, really looking forward to seeing if there's any questions, and thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Alice. So much in there to comment on, and you've once again triggered a load of more questions. So yeah, that AgriSound device, what a brave new world we're in. That's such a fantastic bit of tech, and you guys are involved in so many things, as one would expect as a market leader that's so involved across so many supply chains, as you noted, but you still don't expect to hear you celebrating deforestation in one very isolated situation, and then working so hard to combat it in others. And I think that horses for courses approach that is really brilliant. So I commend you on all that great work that you're doing, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you when we get into the Q&A. Let me just remind our audience to keep on voting for the questions you want us to answer. We've got almost 200 people on the call, and our most popular questions still only got 10 votes. So I asked a few more of you to get in there, have a look at the questions, and give some thumbs up to help us focus. It's improbable now that we're going to be able to get through all of the questions that have been posed. Okay, René, over to you now.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody. My name is René Lyon. I'm a senior consumer scientist at Unilever's Foods Innovation Center in Wageningen in the Netherlands. And I've been involved with our food waste agenda for a couple of years now, both from a consumer behavior angle and also from an operations perspective. And I must admit, as I learn more about the size of the challenge and the importance of it, I've also become increasingly passionate about it. So it's great to get the opportunity to talk to you about food waste. Next slide, please. I think it's one of the most underestimated issues in relation to sustainability, health, and food security. An estimated 1/3 of all food produced is wasted. That's 1.3 billion tons. I'll just say it again, because yesterday I was preparing the slides and I thought 1.3 billion tons. You know, in fact, if food loss and waste were a country, it would be the third biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions, right after China and the US. So this is why the UN Sustainable Development Goals 12.3 is to halve global capita food waste by 2030. As a company, we've signed up to Champions 12.3, a collective of in-government and other key stakeholders that aims to accelerate progress to the Sustainable Development Goal. The next slide. When we signed up, we created an end-to-end framework to reduce food waste. We are busy enrolling our priority third-party manufacturers and raw material suppliers to halve food waste in their operations. We have set a target to halve food waste in our own operations by 50% by 2025, so that's 5 years earlier, versus our baseline year in 2019. And we are committed to zero waste to landfill and ensuring no good food gets destroyed. We help our food service customers tackle food waste in their own operations through education and redistribution. And finally, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes, we inspire and enable consumers to be more resourceful with their food and waste less. Next slide, please. The key elements in our approach to tackle our own food waste is first to set clear targets and measure what we waste. So we signed up to this target, measure, and act approach. Basically, because we can't manage what we can't measure. And then when we know that, we take appropriate action to reduce food waste in our own operations. We've also created a movement in the organization to mobilize everyone to help reduce food waste. We've just reported that we've achieved a 70% reduction in our food waste footprint versus our baseline in 2019. Of course, it's also clear that we can't do this alone, so we're also engaging with partners such as Orbisk, that helps our food service clients measure the food waste with smart bins, and Too Good To Go by offering our products on our platforms. And finally, we work with others to also have an impact with our suppliers and consumers. For example, BRAP in the UK and United Against Food Waste in the Netherlands. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, 1/3 of all food is wasted, and a whopping 60% occurs in consumers' homes. In line with Hellmann's purpose to make taste, not waste, Hellmann's has set itself the goal to inspire and enable consumers to be more resourceful with their food and waste less. And we focused very specifically on the most wasted foods, that are fruits, vegetables, and bread, and on food that people have brought into their homes but have failed to use up. Next slide, please. Of course, this begs the question why people don't use up all their food. And based on our research, we found that people lack time and energy after a long day to spend a lot of time in cooking. And when they look in the fridge and see a random collection of food that's about to go bad, they lack inspiration or lack skills to make a nice meal out of that. And sometimes they just forget the halved cucumber and bell pepper in the back of the fridge. I'm sure that sounds familiar too. Next slide. So we created a targeted intervention in which we asked people to choose one day in the week in which they would make a meal with ingredients that they already had. And we provided them with a flexible cooking approach called the 3+1 approach, a quick and easy approach to making meals. Because in fact, you can always make a meal if you have a base like pasta or rice, some fruit and vegetable, an optional protein, and the +1, a magic touch, which could be Hellmann's mayonnaise, but doesn't have to be. Now, we weren't satisfied with just creating this program, so we actually also tested this. Next slide, please. In one of the biggest food waste studies ever run, over 1,000 Canadian families were asked to participate in a 5-week program, and they were randomly assigned to one of 5 groups. The control group only reported on their food waste. The intervention groups were asked to do a weekly use update and were given flexible recipes based on this 3+1 approach to help them on their way. Some of the groups also got an additional tool, a clip to collect the foods that they wanted to remember to eat, a tracker to keep a tab on foods that they didn't want to forget, or a basket in which they could collect foods. We ran the study in collaboration with our partners, Marketing Mums, the University of Wageningen, and Western University in Ontario, Canada, and B-Works conducted the food work. If we go to the next slide, the results show that the intervention was successful. As you can see, the intervention reduced food waste by 33% versus baseline, the colored lines. This was significantly different from the control group, which also decreased, but not as dramatically. Important was also that the consumers responded that it didn't require too much effort. 70% said it didn't require too much effort. 84% said the program was enjoyable. And 79% was likely to recommend it to others, and 64% said the recipes were easy to make. We can also see that maybe the animation, please, that after 8 weeks after we finish this program, the food waste goes up, back up a little bit, also because we had less respondents who still responded to the questionnaire. But based on the self-report, we also see that the behavior is still. So 81% continued to make the use-up style meals, 64% were still using the 3+1 approach, and 79% said they would continue to use the flexible recipes and the 3+1 approach. Since this study, we've done additional studies in the US and in Canada showing that the program works with similar impact figures, and we have a peer-reviewed publication forthcoming in the academic journal Resource Conservation and Recycling. Next slide, please. Since then, we've also created an app with the program, which you can find in the Canadian, US, and UK app store. I encourage you to give it a try, and that maybe we can try to play the video now, if it works for everybody.
What's up, folks? I'm Andy, and welcome to Fridge Night. One night a week for 5 weeks where I help you get extra from your fridge. The fun starts with planning a fridge night and choosing a day that works best for you. Then we'll make delicious extra meals with food that you already have. We'll learn a whole new way of cooking, aka Flexipes, using the unique 3 +1 approach. It's super important to be aware of how much food you waste. So week 1 is all about tracking. I will be with you every step of the journey, serving up new weekly challenges to add even more fun.
Is it good?
Yeah.
Welcome to Fridge Night, the night where you get extra from your fridge.
Well, thank you. I hope it played as well at your end as it did at my end. That brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you for your attention, and do let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks, René. You shocking statistics at the start of your presentation. So I'm going to ask, I hope not an inappropriate question, and you can, feel free to dodge it. But we're focused on a business, a business audience, and so I'm really interested to know whether this helped sell more Hellmann's, because I think those are key drivers for getting more companies to embrace fabulous programming like that. Did you see the results you were hoping for from a sales perspective, in addition to impacting food waste?
Well,
is
I
there
think
a business case for
I think this is a very targeted behavior change program that focuses, not everybody will be likely to do it, but you may have seen the Super Bowl ad as well earlier this year, which also talks about food waste with the quarterback Mayo. Last year it was with a comedian, I forgot her name, Amy something, Schumacher, I think was her name. So also focusing on food waste. So we both have above the line and below the line communication around food waste. Also because the purpose of Hellmann's is to make taste, not waste. So it's really embedded in the way the business runs. So it's difficult to say whether this particular program has had that impact on sales in itself, but it's sort of a core element to the whole the communication around Hellmann's, that we're on the side of food and therefore we shouldn't waste any food.
Fabulous. No, I think this is an area where across all of the SDGs, to be honest, I think Unilever has excelled in integrating, global goals into your commercial goals in a way that's really inspirational and positive. So this is fantastic stuff. Thanks very much for sharing. And let's now go to our last presenter, Hans.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for having me. My name is Hans Loth, and I'm the head of the partnership with the UN at Rabobank. So maybe first a little bit about Rabobank. Some of you may know it, some of you may not. Rabobank is a systemic bank in the Netherlands, catering to all sorts of needs, retail, corporate, but outside the Netherlands, focusing on food and agriculture. Rabobank is a bank incorporated by farmers. So by design, we very much look at agriculture and food, both from a farmer level as from a supply chain perspective and corporate level. Looking at many of the challenges that we currently see in the world, we see that finance is part of the answer. When we talk about circularity, for instance, as we do today, that's basically a transition. That's why I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about blended finance for today, because we see that is a key transition tool for reaching circularity. And with transition, we mean transition from current business model and food production practices to circularity and less carbon output. Banks tend not to like transition because it's new, it's uncharted territory, and therefore deemed to be risky. It doesn't tend to fit into Excel sheets and models that are, frankly speaking, often imposed by the central regulator. What we therefore thought, let's look along with our clients who are obviously increasingly looking at 2030 and reaching Paris and how to do that. One of the solutions that we came up with is to look at blended finance. And so let's look at the slide after this one and talk a little bit more in detail what that really means. What you basically see is that public sector are increasingly crowding in private sector players to look at SDG transitions. That's what we're talking about today, to look at more sustainable production. Blended finance, basically, on the other hand, looks at roping in public capital for that same journey, as we do at Rabobank, because in essence, it de-risks transactions. I'll talk a little bit about that down the line. What we've done, and we've literally moved from PowerPoint to action. And we are already working with 2 impact funds that we co-incorporated. One of them is a Farm Fit Fund at IDH, and one of them, the other is Agri3 Fund. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that down the line. So if we go to the next slide, we see a little bit more in detail what blended finance is about. Basically, it means that concessional capital, and it can be from our public donors, that can be from family foundations, corporate foundation, ropes in more private capital. Why would it do that? Basically to create impact. So we're luckily not only increasingly looking at financial return, we're also looking at impact return. And I think that goes for corporations, but obviously also for banks, and luckily so, because we need to go that way. So looking at building SDG impact into your transactions is super important. So when we see public capital blending with private capital, we actually see, if we go to the next slide, that it solves an important problem. Because as I mentioned before, transition is a journey that does have an uncertain outcome. So what we see is many high impact transactions, which you would think is a good thing, are deemed not bankable because of that built-in risk. And that's a challenge. So we thought how to solve that, and blended finance with concessional funds basically solves that. Transactions that would in business as usual be deemed unbankable, together with concessional funds, make it bankable, and therefore make those transactions able to execute, able to close, which really helps our client base and obviously the planet and the people in it. When we talk about concessional funds, that might be jargon to some of you. I'd like to use the word patient capital more. So what you then basically do is build an entity like the 2 funds that I spoke to about 5 minutes ago, and build in a patient capital tranche that allows for a longer tenor for a loan and is more flexible on return payments. Literally patient capital, because transition means time, and with blended finance, in essence, you create time and you de-risk. And that helps banks. That helps banks to do more for their clients, to do more for farmers, but also the likes of Danone, Tesco, Unilever, all clients of Rabobank, and are in the webinar today. So let's have another look at the next slide, please. One of the showcases that we built together with UN Environment, FMO, Dutch Development Bank, IDH, and Rabobank is build Agri3 Fund that looks at 3 objectives: forest protection and restoration, sustainable agriculture, and improved rural livelihoods. And what it does, it's actually really simple if you think about it, and I clearly want to stay away from banking jargon, but it's a fund that has capital in it, as I mentioned, patient capital, and you see there the target is $1 billion US. It basically gives guarantees to banks for transactions that are high impact and serve the three goals that are on the screen, but are too risky to close in a business as usual setting. And it literally takes the part of a transaction that is above the risk appetite of the bank and takes that into the fund. So let me give you an example. Normally, a transaction and a loan for a bank could be 7 years. That's already pretty long, but that's easy to calculate in the following example. Because a client, so a farmer or a corporate, might need 10 years to move to a more sustainable and circular production system, i.e., what do you do with the 3 years? The difference between the 10 and the 7. And that's literally what AGI3 Fund does. It takes those 3 years and says, I will take that risk for those couple of years on board, so that the bank is only left with the 7, which is business as usual for the bank, i.e., together they can close the transaction and help the client towards a more sustainable food production. So it's really a nice and simple example to see how finance can actually work in an uncertain world where we need to go clearly beyond our models that we used 20, 30 years ago. If we go to the next slide, please. That's another example of an initiative that we put in for Rabobank. It's called Acorn, which is part of our carbon bank. And what you see on the slide, it's a little bit of a busy slide, but what it does, it tries to connect smallholders and their transition to agroforestry systems to the voluntary carbon market. And actually, the trees and agroforestry that they will grow will sequester carbon. And that has a value. So what we want to do together with Microsoft, who has built the platform for remote sensing, is to actually connect the needs of a smallholder towards a more sustainable food production to the voluntary carbon market, because that generates cash and one needs cash for transition. What obviously needs to happen before the trees are mature, it needs to be pre-financed. So with Carbon Bank and Acorn, we're now building a fund within the bank this time to actually pre-finance those smallholder projects that will move to agroforestry, and as a consequence of that move, will sequester carbon, again, to help themselves, but to help the planet, to help the supply chains, the value chains, and the people on it. So those are two showcases that are a few of many that I can mention that really put finance, but specifically blended finance, to work in a space that traditionally is difficult to finance. Because if you go to an average bank, they would shy away from agriculture because it's highly cyclical and depends on many variables, ranging from climate to many other events and force majeure. And farmers in particular, they are just deemed as high risk, whether we like it or not. So this is one of the few things that we believe a bank can do, and we believe more banks should do, because obviously finance is part of the solution. It's not the magic bullet, for sure. Many things need to come together, but finance is one of them. And hopefully today I've been able to explain a little bit about what blended finance can do and what Rabobank is doing in that space. And we want to do much more to create impact at scale. Back to you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Hans. And really valuable stuff there. And I think it's evident from the questions that are coming in, just what a critical role finance has to play in this, and certainly financial incentives. Can I invite all of the speakers now to turn on your cameras, and we'll get stuck into these questions. And I'm feeling we're a little behind schedule, undoubtedly due to all of my interventions along the way. So I'm gonna try to let you guys do the talking more, and we'll get stuck into these questions. Just with a final call out to our audience, do please give thumbs up to the questions you want us to answer. And to our speakers, if you feel like it, no pressure, but there are options, is an option to do a written answer. And so if you feel like firing off a quick answer to some of the questions that perhaps haven't received enough votes for us to get to, but something that you might be able to just deal with very quickly. I noticed a few questions that might fit the bill. Do please feel free to do that, but don't feel obliged, because if you want to just be focused on questions that are coming your way, and I can maybe just warn Casey Ann and Alice that they're coming your way. But maybe for René and Hans, you might want to have a look at that. But let's get stuck in. Mark's dominating the top of the table with the most votes for his questions. Mark, I hope you didn't get 10 friends to log in and to vote your questions up. But if you did, it worked. So let's go to that first one from Mark Roberts. Are farmers being incentivized to use regenerative practices? Now that question came in, Casey-Ann, during your presentation, but I think equally it'd be great to hear from you, Alice, on that as well, if we may. But Casey-Ann, over to you.
Yeah, thanks indeed. Great. I mean, that seems that there's quite some interest in the topic. So excellent question again. Yes, they are, and they are incentivized in multiple ways. And that differs because that's also why I showed you the map of the world, for example, where we source milk. We are in all regions, in all climate zones, and the way Danone is organized is that when it comes to this kind of incentives, the execution of that is always done locally. And then, of course, you have always your local, let's say, flavor on top of these things. Well, what I can say is that first, an incentive that is used a lot when it comes to milk is to have a sort of bonus premium for those farmers who are able to reduce the carbon footprint of milk, or who are able to improve on animal welfare. That is something that we see upcoming more and more over the last couple of years in the different countries where we source milk. That is one big incentive, I would say. But still, we as Danone, we focus a lot on this farm efficiency improvement, right? Also via this alliance that I mentioned with these kind of partners. And the incentive then may not seem like, oh, here's a bunch of money and start working on it. But if you do go to the different farm and share these kind of results of, let's say, how regenerative practices could improve your farm efficiencies, then you've got something which is much more sustainable and really, improving the resilience of the farm, because it's either a reduction in cost, or it's a reduction in labor, or it's well, in the end of the day, it's improving margin, right? So therefore, we always first and foremost see what can we bring to the farms in order to improve their incentive, their efficiency.
Thank you, Casey-Ann. Alice, anything to add from a Tesco perspective?
Yeah, definitely. I think for us, it's twofold in a way. We're starting by trying to understand a little bit more about what the business case is for regen and what financial incentives could and should look like, in the sense that we largely know it's the right thing to do, that we know that there's evidence to demonstrate that once farmers transition towards more regenerative practices, they often improve yields and things like that, and their bottom line gets a lot better. So actually, what is the right role of those in the supply chain? What's the role of a retailer in thinking about potentially incentivizing that transition period between going from conventional to regen? So with that in mind, we're doing a number of projects with WWF to think about, kind of making the business case essentially for regenerative or agroecology. But having said that, we're not really we don't really want to just sit here and think, oh no, we need more evidence, we need to wait until we know what the right thing to do is. We know what the right thing to do is. So in the meantime, we're kind of plowing on ahead by trying to do, and financially incentivize a number of different on-farm interventions around regen. So supporting specific things like herbal lays, or cover crops in different supply chains, with the idea that if we can start to seed it in different parts of our supply chain, hopefully there'll be kind of farmer to farmer knowledge exchange and things, and that will help scale it and spread it, because that is a really big challenge for us. We can incentivize bits and pieces within our supply chain that can have a really great impact, but it's trying to achieve that scale that can be a little bit challenging. But we're also trying to integrate regen into other areas of the work that we do to make sure that it's incentivized in other ways. So leaf mark, for example, that we are requiring all of our fresh produce growers to comply with. It's not regen, it's not a regen standard, but there's a huge section in there about soil health. It is really about that integrated farm management that I think is very similar in a way to regen. So trying to start embedding that with those supply chains. We also work with our sustainable farming groups on sustainability scorecards, which again have kind of regenerative principles very much embedded in them. So we're trying to look at a number of different ways really, and what the right way for us as a retailer is to get involved in, or to help support regen in our supply chains.
Can I ask you a bit more about leaf mark? Because that sounds like you've created a very strong incentive for farmers to become more sustainable if they want to be in your supply chain. Sometimes this sort of thing is controversial. How are you supporting your farmers to get to that standard?
That's a really good question. So for us, for leaf mark, it is a really high, really robust environmental standard. So we're really proud that it's such a big part of our supply chains. But it is potentially a challenging one. The reason we made that decision is we did just do it for fresh produce, so fruit and veg, because 50% of our suppliers were already leaf mark certified. Waitrose are also doing fully leaf mark, and I think Aldi have just announced that they will too. So I think there was a general consensus across the industry that this was a standard that would work really well for fresh produce, and that most growers were kind of already on that journey towards, if that makes sense. But we've put in a really long rollout period. We've done a huge amount of work helping do sort of knowledge exchange and webinars and things in our supplier network. So we are really aiming to support farmers in the transition towards leaf mark. But you're right, it's a different mechanism. It's not necessarily an incentive. It's now a requirement to do business. But I think there is an element of that in terms of core sustainability. I think while we do want to be rewarding farmers for going above and beyond, it's dangerous territory to get into to say, well, we want to put, end up putting costs up for consumers or something like that around what should be quite core sustainability standards.
No, sounds great. Thank you. Now, before we move on from this question on incentives, I just want to check in with you, Hans. If some of the other examples you had, are there benefits in terms of access to capital or lower cost of capital for farmers that are more sustainable? Is that something that you're seeing happening now or in development?
That is for sure happening. The irony is that farmers tend not to have access to the right kind of finance. Either they're bigger and they are in need of innovation, and they need a specific kind of patient capital which is not readily available. That's not plain vanilla. And that's a larger group, and we're becoming more dependent on that group by the day, which is smallholders on at least 3 continents, Latin Africa and Asia, that have no systematic access to finance in the first place. So that is really, I would say, a call to action for all of us to help think along how to unpack that one, because that's really a challenge. And that group tends not to have access to the financial means to produce food sustainably, which to a certain extent is one of the causes of deforestation. Because if you cannot invest in your own plot of land, you just move to the next plot where trees are still standing and you just chop them away, which is a shame, of course, but from the smallholder perspective also maybe understandable, because there's no viable business case as an alternative. So if we offer a finance package that actually makes it attractive to stay where you are and invest in your piece of land and just make it into regenerative agriculture, use the right type of fertilizer, get some education through technical assistance, i.e. Get some finance to help you. That's really what we're seeking and doing here, because, and it's a stretch because smallholders tend to be unbankable also for many banks in emerging markets. So we need to really come up with smart ways, such as blended finance, to look for ways to de-risk and enable that group to be more sustainable, because it's not about not wanting, but being able to. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. I think it's really important to point out just how, well, reinforcing how complex this issue is, but and that the solutions aren't necessarily obvious. Okay, let's move on rapidly. The next question in the votes is Mark again. So I think we're going to come to you first on this, Alice. Supermarkets control the price and cost for farmers. A huge change that would empower farmers is giving them a bigger say in their costs. Are Tesco committed to making that kind of change, or is the emphasis on change still being placed on the farms?
I think it's a bit of everything, really. We are very much committed to supporting farmers in the transition towards agroecological practices. I think that is we acknowledge that we've got a huge role to play, as do everyone up and down the supply chain. It's a responsibility that sits in part with Tesco, but I also think with everyone all the way up to the consumer, to make sure that we're completely redesigning supply chains and systems so that we can be supportive, so that these practices fit. Essentially, they fit within the way that we work and the way that supply chains function. So I think obviously that's where it all comes back down to, is costs. So in part it is around that. I think the other part is around making sure that we're embedding these practices as business as usual, finding ways to make sure that they are fully integrated, all the way from the farm gate. It's a challenging environment in terms of, in the UK, the cost of living crisis is a really interesting time to be working in a retail business with a massive sustainability focus, because it shifts the levers that we have available to us. It changes the way that consumers feel when they walk into a supermarket. They're not necessarily looking for something that's sustainably sourced. So we know that it's our obligation as the retailer to make sure that everything in the supermarket is responsibly and sustainably sourced. So for us, I think it's about trying to work collectively up and down the supply chain to be supporting farmers as much as possible, and at the same time working across the sector, again, in a pre-competitive way, so that we're all asking for the same stuff. We're not making life unnecessarily difficult for farmers, and we've all got the same focus in mind. And I think where we get to with the partnership with WWF is hopefully starting to get there, that agroecology and regen is so embedded in that, and the whole point of that is for us to be supportive and supported in changing our business practices, and particularly our commercial practices, to be supporting the transition towards agroecology, because that is, making it financially viable in many cases is what will give it the longevity that it so desperately needs, and that the environment so desperately needs. So yeah.
Thanks, Alice. So again, I think this really flags the complexity and the challenge of that there's a limited amount of money available from consumers to spend on food. And I think this, interesting to me, brings in some of the work that René is doing. And if we could reduce food waste, that would put more money in the pockets of consumers that could then, in theory, flow through to more money to farmers. It's about moving all these pieces around to find an optimal food system. And okay, interesting stuff. Now, okay, that's Mark. Now on to the question from Tom that's been up there for a while. Kasian, this is coming at you. I guess a gentle accusation that you've been too humble in terms of Danone's power in the marketplace. But I think the key point I'm interested in this question is just, how do you decide where to focus your resources when you're making interventions? And I suppose I think that might be a question for all. How do you prioritize and make those resource allocation decisions in order to have the greatest impact on driving regenerative models.
Yeah. No, thanks very much for giving the opportunity to highlight. Indeed, I like the modest approach, but I think it's Tom who asked the question, is perfectly spot on, right? We do know how to do business in the dairy space, right? When I say we're the drop in the ocean is when you look at the volume of milk and the access to farmers. And of course, 60,000 farms is still a lot. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of ground. There's a lot of animals. There's a lot of ground to cover, if you would like to say that. The way we want to do that is really, and again, that's one reason why I showed you this map of the world where we are active, is always that we look what is locally relevant, right? Because really the last thing we want is to just make a huge commitment and just say, oh, this is the way we are going to farm, right? And then just drop it down, push it down basically into the supply chain. So the way we do, we've got multiple things, always that. And that's also part of my job, is to really connect the strategy, including potential fundings and partners, connect that really with the local teams, because they know the markets, they know the customer, so to say, our supplier, if you like, and then see what's really necessary. So, and then it comes really to make it very scattered, because then in regions like in the north of France, we're going to focus on how to get more milk out of grass, so then we bring in experts. We really invest there in time, and as well with these kind of alliances, as I mentioned, to share with them, okay, what can we deal, how can we share knowledge in that part of the bush. And if it's come to North African farmers who are smallholders, then it really comes down to the bottom. What do they need? Well, they need access to feed, because that's the biggest issue there first, amongst other things. And for feed, you need land and you need water. So how can we make that locally? Because sometimes they cannot import it, so it has to grow locally. But that means then we have to be there. And one of the things that we utilize for that is a so-called Danone Ecosystem Fund, which is a fund from Danone, which really is there to make a co-creation with local partners in order to improve resilience of farms, improve also farm efficiencies, and obviously also to make sure that they transform into regenerative agricultural practices. Right, so we always go locally. We see what's available locally, local partners, local funding, and then we make the connection either with our own funds or with people, with partners. That's in a nutshell how we make that connection.
Thank you, Kees-Jan. We're running out of time, so I'm going to have to. Here's the plan. I think 30 seconds each. If there's anything that you thought you were going to get to say on this webinar and you didn't get to say it, now's your chance. So sort of final words, just to get out any final message that if you want to just re-emphasize something you did say or something that we didn't get to, it would be now's your chance. Let's just go back in the order and that you spoke. So Kees-Jan, back to you. Do you have any further final words that you wanted to get out?
Well, just to emphasize again, and as part of my my 10-minute speech, was really that yes, we take responsibility. Yes, we have a business to run. We want to provide health through food to as many people as possible, but we also want to do that in a collaborative mode, really with partners. We are not, let's say, being there to know it all. No, definitely not. We need to work with partners in the value chain, and I'm so happy to see that also here in the panel, right? With all of these kind of partners, we have some sort of connection, right? Or our partnership or alliance. And I think that's extremely important if we want to make that change in agriculture for the good.
Thank you, Kees-Jan. Alice.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think the first thing I want to say is how phenomenal the questions are. I think we could spend all day going through those and answering them, and there's so many that I would love to get into. And I'm going to pick out one essentially for my last 30 seconds, and it's the question about is there a gap between intention, what we intend to do around sustainability and the practice and implementation? And I think the answer is that there is a huge gap, a monumental gap. And I mean, just like the other panelists, Tesco has supply chains across nearly every country in the world, which means every biome. It does so many multiple different ecosystems. It's so challenging. It is, we can talk about all these incredible examples in our respective supply chains, but getting scale across a global, across a global supply base is truly challenging. I think we can overcome it. But I think what we really need is strong data, metrics to find ways to do this, support from governments, whether that in particularly support aimed at farmers, but where we can be working alongside government policies. I think that will be where we can also make some hopefully quite useful change, working both at a regional level, but also at a supply chain level. This is going to become particularly interesting and potentially challenging with the Science-Based Targets Initiative for Nature. That will be directing us to look at particular areas and ecosystems where we're having an impact versus supply chains. So thinking about that and being realistic about the challenges of operating during a cost of living crisis and in a time of continuing climate shocks and geopolitical shocks. But I'm quite inspired. I think leaving this, I feel like we can hopefully do a lot of this. And yeah, again, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Alice. It's been great having you. Renee. Are you muted? I think, Renee.
I am.
There we go.
I can only ask you to join the food waste fight against food waste. Do it at home. Use Fridge Night. Visit the RAF website if you want more tips and tricks about how to reduce food waste in your own home. Measure what you waste, because you'll be surprised unpleasantly, I'm sure. And in your company, sign up to the Champions 12.3 and tackle food waste in your own operations. Or if you're in the UK, sign up to the, I just looked it up because it's called the Food Waste Reduction Roadmap, which is an industry-wide roadmap in the UK, where it's also focusing on tackling food waste. So let's get that 1.3 billion tons of food waste down.
Perfect. Thanks, Renee. Good shout. And Hans, last to you.
Yeah, very briefly, with an eye on the clock. I think it was said already, it's about partnerships, be it in the supply chain, be it between public and private. So I'd like to highlight that part. I think it's about knowledge sharing through webinars like these today, but also action as a third leg, and do things together with impact. So let me leave that back to you, Steve.
Perfect. Thank you very much. All right. We've already posted in the chat a link to register for the final session in the series. It's going to be on the 19th of April. We're looking at fashion and textiles. So there's going to be an agricultural component to that again. Another fabulous lineup of speakers, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that. For today, thank you to Kasian, Alice, Renee, and Hans. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Really, really interesting. Thanks for being so generous with your time and your knowledge. Thank you very much to our audience, as always, for being so engaged and giving us such fantastic questions to work with. When we finish, a survey will pop up. Please take a minute to fill it out. Your feedback is invaluable in helping us to make these sessions more useful to you. And we're run over by a minute. I apologize for that and wish you a great rest of the afternoon. And thank you very much for joining us today.